Hello there, and welcome to what we are ambitiously calling a complete guide to the world's most contested regions. Now, when you hear disputed territory, you might picture two old men angrily pointing at a fence. And yes, sometimes it is that, but on a much, much larger scale, with armies, nuclear weapons, and centuries of baggage. These are the planet's geopolitical hotspots, the places on the map where the lines get blurry, angry, and often tragically violent. They are the ultimate, its complicated relationship statuses of international relations, and understanding them is crucial because they are not just squabbles over remote patches of land. These disputes are the tectonic plates of global politics. They shift and grind against each other, creating earthquakes that redefine alliances, redraw maps, and dictate the flow of everything from oil to microchips. They are crucibles where national identity is forged in the fires of conflict and where the very idea of a nation is put to the test. Who belongs here? Who gets to rule? Who owns the vast resources buried under the soil or swimming in the sea? The answers to these questions are rarely simple and almost never agreed upon by everyone involved. So tonight we're going on a global tour of these fiercely contested lands. We'll look at why they're fought over, who is fighting and what's at stake. Think of it as a Lonely Planet guide for places you probably shouldn't visit without a flak jacket and a deep understanding of post-colonial history. From Himalayan peaks to Mediterranean islands, these are the stories of division, identity and power that shape the world we live in. So buckle up, because this is going to be a bumpy and frankly quite depressing ride. Let's begin. Right, let's kick things off with a classic. And by classic, I mean a deeply entrenched, heartbreakingly complex conflict that has festered for over 75 years. Kashmir, nestled in the Himalayas, it's a place of such staggering beauty that it's often called paradise on earth, which is a bit like calling a shark-infested volcano a lovely spot for a swim. The region is currently carved up between three nuclear-armed neighbors: India, which controls Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan, which controls Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, and China, which nibbled off a piece called Aksai Chin. It's the world's most militarized zone, a geopolitical three-way tug-of-war where the rope is an entire population. The roots of this mess go back to 1947 and the partition of British India. The whole subcontinent was violently split along religious lines into India and Pakistan. The princely states, including Kashmir, were supposed to choose which nation to join. Kashmir, with its Muslim majority but Hindu ruler, dithered. And when Pashtun tribesmen from Pakistan invaded, the Maharaja panicked and acceded to India in exchange for military help. Pakistan cried foul, India sent in troops, and the first of several wars erupted. It was, to put it mildly, a catastrophic start, like a marriage that begins with both families suing each other at the altar. The result was a ceasefire line, the line of control, which is less of a line and more of a heavily fortified suggestion that everyone stay on their side, please. It's a de facto border, but not an internationally recognized one, which is diplomatic speak for a temporary solution that has now lasted 3/4 of a century. India's claim is based on that original accession document, while Pakistan's is based on the region's Muslim majority and the principle of self-determination. Both arguments have just enough historical and legal ambiguity to keep the lawyers and soldiers busy indefinitely. For decades, this has meant simmering conflict, punctuated by full-blown wars and a persistent, brutal insurgency against Indian rule within the Kashmir Valley. India accuses Pakistan of funding and training militants, a charge Pakistan denies with all the sincerity of a cat sitting next to a broken vase. The human cost has been immense, with tens of thousands of lives lost, countless disappearances, and a population living under the constant shadow of military occupation, curfews, and communication blackouts. It's a pressure cooker with the lid welded shut. And why is it so significant? Well, apart from the staggering human tragedy, it's the only place on Earth where two nuclear-armed states, who absolutely despise each other, are face to face. Any major escalation could, and this is not hyperbole, trigger a nuclear exchange. It's a regional flashpoint with global consequences, a beautiful valley holding the entire world hostage. It's a paradise lost, held captive by history, nationalism, and the terrifying logic of mutually assured destruction. What a cheerful start to our list. And now for a conflict so contentious, so emotionally charged, that merely saying its name is enough to start a fight in a comment section: Israel and Palestine. At its heart, this is a dispute over a piece of land roughly the size of New Jersey, but one claimed by two peoples as their ancestral homeland. It's a story of competing national narratives, displacement, and a seemingly endless cycle of violence. For Jews, it is the land promised by God, their historic home from which they were exiled. For Palestinians, it is the land their ancestors have lived on for centuries, from which they have been displaced. Both claims are deeply felt and central to each group's identity. The modern conflict really ignited with the rise of Zionism in the late 19th century and accelerated after World War II. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan to divide British Mandate Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states. Jewish leaders accepted it, Arab leaders rejected it. When Israel declared independence in 1948, it was immediately attacked by its Arab neighbors. Israel won that war, expanding its territory and leading to what Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, where over 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes, becoming refugees. This event is the foundational trauma of the Palestinian experience. Today, the core of the dispute revolves around the territories Israel captured in the 1967 Six-Day War: the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. Palestinians seek these territories for a future independent state. But the reality on the ground is far more complex. The West Bank is a patchwork of Palestinian towns and cities, and a growing number of Israeli settlements, which most of the world considers illegal under international law. These settlements are connected by Israeli-only roads, creating a fragmented landscape that makes a contiguous Palestinian state look like a gerrymandered congressional district designed by a madman. Gaza, meanwhile, is a densely populated strip of land under a crippling blockade by both Israel and Egypt since the militant group Hamas took control in 2007. It's often described as the world's largest open-air prison, a place of extreme poverty and desperation from which rockets are periodically fired into Israel, prompting devastating military responses. And then there's Jerusalem, a city holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Israel claims all of it as its eternal, undivided capital, while Palestinians envision East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state. It's a zero-sum game played in the most sacred city on earth. The global importance of this conflict cannot be overstated. It is a central issue for the entire Muslim and Arab world, a key driver of regional instability, and a major foreign policy challenge for the United States and Europe. The two-state solution, the internationally favored roadmap for peace, looks less likely with each passing year. For millions, it is the ultimate symbol of occupation and injustice. For millions of others, it's a story of survival and the realization of a 2,000-year-old dream. It's a Gordian knot of history, religion, and nationalism, and so far, no one has found a sword sharp enough to cut through it. Let's move on to an island that keeps presidents, generals, and CEOs up at night: Taiwan. Officially the Republic of China, or ROC, it's a thriving democratic nation of 23 million people with its own government, military, and currency. It's a high-tech powerhouse that produces the vast majority of the world's most advanced semiconductors. Essentially the phone you're probably watching this on, the car you drive, the computer you work on, they all depend on this one island. The problem: the massive country 100 miles to the west, the People's Republic of China, or PRC, views Taiwan not as a country, but as a rogue province that must and will be reunified with the mainland, by force, if necessary. This bizarre geopolitical soap opera began in 1949, at the end of the Chinese Civil War. The Communists, led by Mao Zedong, won on the mainland and established the PRC. The losing side, the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan and continued to call themselves the legitimate government of all of China, the ROC. For decades, the world had to pick a side. Initially, most countries, including the United States, recognized the ROC in Taiwan, but China's growing power was impossible to ignore. And in the 1970s, most of the world, including the United States and the UN, switched diplomatic recognition to the PRC in Beijing. This left Taiwan in a state of permanent diplomatic limbo. It's a country in all but name. This is maintained by a masterpiece of diplomatic waffle called strategic ambiguity, particularly by the United States. The US acknowledges Beijing's One China principle, the idea that there is only one China, but it doesn't endorse the PRC's claim to Taiwan. At the same time, America sells Taiwan billions of dollars in defensive weapons and implies it might come to the island's aid if it were attacked. It's the international equivalent of telling your two friends who hate each other, "I'm not taking sides, but here's a baseball bat for your friend, just in case." For China, reunification is a cornerstone of its national rejuvenation project. President Xi Jinping has made it clear that the Taiwan question cannot be passed down from generation to generation. This has been accompanied by a massive military build-up and increasingly aggressive actions, like sending fighter jets into Taiwan's air defense identification zone on an almost daily basis. It's a constant, menacing reminder that Beijing is losing patience. Taiwan's people, meanwhile, have developed a strong, distinct identity and have shown little to no interest in being absorbed by an authoritarian state. So why does the world care so much? Two reasons. First, as I mentioned, semiconductors. A Chinese takeover of Taiwan would give Beijing control over the most critical component of the modern global economy. It would be like giving one country control over all the world's oil, but for technology. Second, a war over Taiwan would likely involve the United States pitting two nuclear-armed superpowers against each other in a conflict that would make the war in Ukraine look like a minor skirmish. It's a flashpoint with the potential to trigger a global economic depression and a third world war, all over the status of one island. No pressure, Taiwan. Okay, let's turn to a dispute you might not have even heard of, which is precisely the problem. Western Sahara. This is a vast, sparsely populated slab of desert on the Atlantic coast of Africa. It's often called Africa's last colony, and for good reason. For the past half-century, its fate has been caught between its neighbor Morocco, which claims the entire territory as its southern provinces, and the Polisario Front, an independence movement backed by Algeria that represents the indigenous Sahrawi people, and has declared the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, or SADR. It's a long, slow-burning conflict fought in the sand and in the halls of international diplomacy. The story begins, as so many of these stories do, with European colonialism. This area was a Spanish colony called Spanish Sahara. In 1975, as Spain was preparing to decolonize under pressure from the UN, which called for a referendum on self-determination for the Sahrawi people, Morocco decided to take matters into its own hands. King Hassan II organized the Green March, where 350,000 unarmed Moroccans marched into the territory to claim it. Spain, in the throes of its own political transition after the death of Franco, basically threw up its hands and signed a secret deal to partition the territory between Morocco and Mauritania. It was a colonial power shirking its final duty. The Polisario Front, which had been fighting for independence from Spain, then turned its guns on the new occupiers. Mauritania eventually gave up its claim after years of guerrilla warfare. But Morocco doubled down. It built the berm, a massive 1,700-mile-long sand wall fortified with landmines, bunkers and electronic sensors, to seal off the resource-rich western two-thirds of the territory that it controls. This wall, one of the longest military barriers in the world, separates the Moroccan-controlled areas from the sliver of desert controlled by the Polisario Front, and it has split Sahrawi families for decades. The stakes here are not just about sovereignty, they're about resources. The Moroccan-controlled part of Western Sahara has rich phosphate mines, a key ingredient in fertilizer, and some of the most fertile fishing waters in the world. Morocco has invested heavily in the region, building infrastructure and encouraging its citizens to move there, in a move critics call a settlement policy designed to change the demographic makeup of the territory and cement its control. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Sahrawi refugees have languished for nearly 50 years in camps in the harsh Algerian desert, waiting for the UN-promised referendum that has never happened. The international community is deeply divided. Most African nations recognize the SADR. But major world powers like France and, more recently, the United States under the Trump administration have recognized Moroccan sovereignty in exchange for diplomatic favors. The UN mission MINURSO is there to monitor a ceasefire and theoretically organize that referendum, but its hands are tied. It's a frozen conflict that occasionally thaws into violence, a stark example of how international law and the principle of self-determination can be bulldozed by strategic interests and a very, very long wall of sand. All right, let's talk about a peninsula that went from a sleepy Black Sea vacation spot to the epicenter of a new Cold War Crimea. In 2014, the world watched, stunned, as Russian special forces, the infamous little green men in unmarked uniforms, fanned out across Crimea, seizing government buildings and military bases. This was followed by a hastily arranged referendum, held quite literally at gunpoint, where an official 97% of voters supposedly chose to join Russia. Shortly after, Vladimir Putin signed a treaty absorbing Crimea into the Russian Federation. Ukraine and most of the world denounced it as an illegal annexation, a blatant violation of international law. Russia, of course, called it reunification. Crimea's history is incredibly complex, having been passed between empires for centuries, but for our purposes, the key date is 1954. In a move that no one thought would matter much at the time, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. It was a symbolic gesture within a single country, the USSR. It was like moving a couch from the living room to the den. You're not expecting the den to declare independence and take the couch with it. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country, and Crimea, couch and all, went with it. For Russia, this was a source of immense strategic and historical grievance. Crimea is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, based in the port city of Sevastopol. Losing that warm water port, its key naval access to the Mediterranean, was unthinkable for the Kremlin. Furthermore, many Russians view Crimea as historically and culturally Russian land, a sentiment shared by a significant portion of Crimea's ethnic Russian majority. So when a pro-Western revolution in Kyiv ousted Ukraine's pro-Russian president in 2014, Putin saw his chance to correct a historical injustice and secure his strategic interests in one fell swoop. The annexation was a game-changer. It was the first time since World War II that a European country had annexed the territory of another. It shattered the post-Cold War consensus that national borders were sacrosanct. The international response was sanctions and condemnation, but no one was willing to go to war with Russia over it. The move was wildly popular within Russia, boosting Putin's approval ratings to record highs. For him, it was a triumphant restoration of Russian power and a clear message to the West. Don't meddle in our backyard. And of course, we now know that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning. The annexation of Crimea was the prelude to the war in Donbass and ultimately the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Ukraine remains adamant that it will liberate all of its territory, including Crimea. For Ukraine, it's a matter of sovereignty and territorial integrity. For Russia, it's a red line and a symbol of its imperial revival. The peninsula is now a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier for Russia, projecting power across the Black Sea and a primary target for Ukrainian missiles and drones. A vacation spot it is no longer. Let's pan over to a body of water that has more overlapping claims than a multi-car pile-up, the South China Sea. On a map it looks simple enough, but in reality it's a cauldron of competing territorial claims involving China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia and Brunei. Everyone wants a piece of the action, and the main reason can be summed up in 3 words: fish, oil and shipping lanes. It's one of the most important maritime crossroads on the planet, and it's becoming one of the most dangerous. The main protagonist or antagonist, depending on your point of view, is China. Beijing claims almost the entire sea as its own, based on a U-shaped 9-dash line drawn on a map in the 1940s. This line is, to put it politely, historically dubious and legally baseless. In 2016, an international tribunal at The Hague overwhelmingly ruled against China's claim in a case brought by the Philippines, a ruling that China dismissed as a piece of paper. China's attitude is basically that of a toddler who has drawn a crayon circle around all the toys in the playroom and declared them his. To enforce this claim, China has been engaged in a breathtaking campaign of island building. They've taken tiny submerged reefs and rocks in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, and, through massive dredging operations, transformed them into full-fledged artificial islands, complete with military-grade airfields, naval bases, and missile systems. It's the geopolitical equivalent of building a fortress in your neighbor's swimming pool and then claiming you own the water. This has allowed China to project power hundreds of miles from its coast, intimidating other claimants and fishermen. The other countries in the region are understandably not thrilled. They have their own historical claims to various islands and maritime zones. We regularly see tense standoffs between Chinese Coast Guard vessels and ships from Vietnam or the Philippines. The Chinese employ grey zone tactics, using Coast Guard and maritime militia instead of the Navy to harass and block other nations' vessels, often using water cannons in a way that's aggressive but designed to stay just below the threshold of an act of war. It's a high-stakes game of chicken played with massive ships. And why should the rest of the world care about this aquatic squabble? Because about a third of all global shipping, worth trillions of dollars, passes through the South China Sea every year. Freedom of navigation is a huge deal for countries like the United States, Japan, and Australia, who regularly send their warships through the area on freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, to challenge China's excessive claims. This makes the South China Sea a potential flashpoint for a major conflict between the United States and China, a battle for control over the future of maritime law and the balance of power in Asia. Now, for a dispute that is honestly literally preventing two major countries from officially ending World War II, I'm talking about the Kuril Islands, or as Japan calls them, the Northern Territories. This is a volcanic archipelago stretching from Japan's northern island of Hokkaido to Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. The dispute is over the four southernmost islands, Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan, and the Habamai Islets. Russia controls them. Japan claims them. And because of this disagreement, Russia and Japan have never signed a formal peace treaty to end the war they fought over 75 years ago. It's the longest diplomatic hangover in modern history. The origins, as you might guess, are in the final chaotic days of World War II. In August 1945, just days before Japan's surrender, the Soviet Union, honoring a pledge made to the Allies, invaded Japanese-held territory in Manchuria and Korea. As part of this offensive, Soviet forces seized the entire Kuril island chain, which had been under Japanese control. They then expelled the approximately 17,000 Japanese residents and have occupied the islands ever since. For Russia, the islands are a legitimate spoil of war, their sovereignty confirmed by post-war agreements like the Yalta Conference. Japan, however, sees it very differently. They argue that the four southernmost islands are not historically part of the Kuril chain at all, but are an inherent part of Japan, the Northern Territories. They point to treaties from the 19th century that established the border between the Russian and Japanese empires and placed these specific islands under Japanese sovereignty. From Tokyo's perspective, this was an illegal seizure of their land, and they have demanded their return ever since. Every official map in Japan shows these four islands as part of their territory, often with a stern note about their illegal occupation by Russia. For decades, the two sides have been locked in a diplomatic stalemate. There have been moments of hope, talks of 2+ Alpha solutions, where Russia might return the two smaller islands in exchange for a peace treaty and economic cooperation. But nationalist sentiment on both sides has always scuttled any potential deal. For many Russians, giving back any land won in the Great Patriotic War is unthinkable. For Japan, accepting only two islands would mean abandoning their claim to the two larger, more significant ones. It's a classic case of immovable object meets irresistible force. So why do these remote, sparsely populated islands still matter so much? Strategically, they are crucial for Russia. They guard the entrance to the Sea of Okhotsk, giving Russia's Pacific Fleet secure access to the Pacific Ocean. Economically, the surrounding waters are rich in fish, and there are potential offshore oil and gas reserves. But mostly it's about national pride and historical principle. And since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, any hope of a resolution has completely evaporated. Russia has designated Japan an unfriendly country, militarized the islands further, and abandoned all peace treaty negotiations. The World War II hangover, it seems, is set to continue indefinitely. Our next stop is in the Caucasus, a region of ancient hatreds and breathtaking mountains. We're talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, known to Armenians as Artsakh. This is a mountainous, landlocked enclave that for decades was at the heart of a bitter conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Until very recently, it was a de facto independent republic with an ethnic Armenian population, but internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. It was a brutal, emotional conflict rooted in competing claims of history, culture, and self-determination, which has now reached a sudden and tragic conclusion. The dispute exploded into the open as the Soviet Union was collapsing. Nagorno-Karabakh was an autonomous region within the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, but its population was overwhelmingly ethnic Armenian. With the iron grip of Moscow loosening, the region's parliament voted to join Armenia, a move Azerbaijan violently opposed. This led to the First Nagorno-Karabakh War in the early 1990s, a brutal conflict that resulted in an Armenian victory. Armenian forces took control of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, as well as several surrounding Azerbaijani districts, creating a buffer zone and linking the enclave to Armenia proper. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced on both sides, creating a legacy of mutual hatred. For nearly 30 years, the situation was frozen. Artsakh existed as an unrecognized state, heavily reliant on Armenia for everything. International mediation efforts led by the Minsk Group went nowhere. Azerbaijan, humiliated by its defeat and growing rich from oil and gas revenues, spent decades building up its military, waiting for its moment of revenge. For Armenians, Artsakh was a cradle of their history and Christian faith, a symbol of national survival after the genocide of the early 20th century. For Azerbaijanis, it was an illegally occupied part of their sovereign territory, and the displacement of their people was a national wound that never healed. That moment of revenge came in 2020. In the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, a technologically superior Azerbaijani military, heavily backed by Turkey and using advanced drones, crushed Armenian forces in just 44 days. A Russian-brokered ceasefire forced Armenia to cede most of the territories it had held for decades, leaving Nagorno-Karabakh itself isolated and vulnerable, with only a thin corridor to Armenia protected by Russian peacekeepers. It was a stunning reversal of fortunes, redrawing the map of the South Caucasus by force. The final act came in September 2023. Azerbaijan launched a lightning one-day military offensive, and the fragile de facto state of Artsakh collapsed completely. Faced with total defeat, the government surrendered and agreed to dissolve itself. In the days that followed, virtually the entire ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, more than 100,000 people, fled to Armenia, fearing ethnic cleansing. After centuries of Armenian presence, the region was emptied of its people in less than a week. It was the brutal, definitive end to one of the world's most intractable frozen conflicts, a stark reminder that some disputes don't end in compromise, but in total victory for one side and a national tragedy for the other. Let's visit a place where a border isn't just a line on a map, but a scar across the heart of a nation, the Korean Peninsula. The division between North and South Korea is perhaps the most famous and most dangerous ongoing dispute in the world. On one side, you have the Republic of Korea, South Korea, a vibrant, hypermodern democracy and economic powerhouse. On the other, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, a totalitarian, impoverished and nuclear-armed dynasty. Separating them is the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, which is ironically the most heavily militarized border on Earth. Like so many of these messes, this one has its roots in the end of World War II. After 35 years of brutal Japanese colonial rule, Korea was supposed to be liberated. Instead, the victorious Allies decided to split the peninsula at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union would oversee the north and the United States would oversee the south, with the idea of holding elections to unify the country later. Of course, this was the dawn of the Cold War, and cooperation between the US and USSR was about as likely as a vegan barbecue. Two separate, ideologically opposed states were born. In 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviets, invaded the South, triggering the Korean War. This was a horrifically brutal conflict that dragged in the United States, the UN and China and resulted in millions of deaths. After 3 years of fighting that saw the front lines surge up and down the peninsula, the war ended in 1953 with an armistice, a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. That means technically the two Koreas are still at war. The border ended up roughly where it started, but the division was now sealed in blood and concrete. Since then, the two Koreas have taken wildly divergent paths. The South, after a period of military dictatorship, transformed into a global success story. The North, under the bizarre and brutal Kim dynasty, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un, retreated into a Stalinist personality cult, pursuing a military-first policy that has led to widespread famine while developing a nuclear weapons program that now poses a direct threat to its neighbors and the United States. It's a surreal contrast. K-pop and Samsung on one side, gulags and missile tests on the other. Despite the Hermetic Seal, the idea of reunification remains a powerful, if distant, dream for many Koreans, especially older generations who remember a unified country. Millions of families remain separated by the DMZ, unable to see or contact relatives for over 70 years. There have been periods of thaw, sunshine policies, and dramatic summits with leaders shaking hands over the border. But these have always been followed by renewed hostility, provocations, and North Korean missile tests. It's a volatile cycle of hope and despair, a family feud played out with artillery and nuclear warheads, with no end in sight. For our final stop, we're heading to the sunny Mediterranean, to an island that looks like a holiday paradise, but is, in fact, home to Europe's last divided capital, Cyprus. Since 1974, the island has been split in two by a UN-patrolled buffer zone known as the Green Line. In the south, you have the internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus, which is predominantly Greek Cypriot and a member of the European Union. In the north, you have the self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is predominantly Turkish Cypriot and recognized only by Turkey. It's a division that has physically and politically fractured an entire nation for half a century. The conflict is between the island's two main communities, Greek Cypriots, who make up the majority, and Turkish Cypriots, the minority. Tensions simmered for years after Cyprus gained independence from Britain in 1960. The power-sharing government established by the constitution was plagued by distrust and eventually collapsed. Many Greek Cypriots dreamed of enosis or union with Greece, while Turkish Cypriots feared being marginalized and looked to Turkey for protection, favoring Taksim or partition. It was a recipe for disaster, a clash of competing nationalisms on one small island. The pot boiled over in 1974. A coup backed by the military junta then ruling Greece was staged in Cyprus with the aim of achieving enosis. In response, Turkey, citing its right as a guarantor power under the 1960 Treaty of Independence, launched a military intervention. Turkish forces invaded the north of the island, ostensibly to protect the Turkish Cypriot community. The invasion led to the displacement of around 160,000 Greek Cypriots who fled south and about 50,000 Turkish Cypriots who moved north, cementing the island's ethnic partition. The result is the bizarre reality of today. The Green Line runs for 180 kilometers, cutting through towns, villages, and the capital city, Nicosia, which is the last divided capital in the world. You can literally walk through a checkpoint in the middle of a bustling shopping street and cross from one side to the other, a surreal journey through a frozen conflict. The north has become heavily dependent on Turkey, which maintains a large military presence and has encouraged tens of thousands of Turkish settlers to move to the island, a demographic shift that further complicates any potential solution. Countless rounds of UN-sponsored reunification talks have failed over the decades. The sticking points are always the same power-sharing arrangements, property claims from displaced persons, the presence of Turkish troops, and the status of the Turkish settlers. In 2004, a UN plan for reunification was put to a vote. It was approved by Turkish Cypriots, but overwhelmingly rejected by Greek Cypriots, who felt it didn't adequately address their concerns. The dispute remains a major headache for the EU and a source of tension between NATO allies Greece and Turkey. It's a paradise partitioned, a beautiful island scarred by a line on a map that has become a chasm of mistrust. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour of 10 of the world's most intractable disputes. And believe me, this is just the tip of the geopolitical iceberg. We didn't even have time to properly get into the Russian-backed breakaway regions in Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, or the bizarre Soviet fossil that is Transnistria in Moldova, or the windswept Falkland Islands, which Britain and Argentina had a rather nasty disagreement about. We skipped the Golan Heights, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, and even the Halaib Triangle, a patch of desert claimed by both Egypt and Sudan. The world, it turns out, is full of places where the maps don't match the reality on the ground. What all these conflicts show us, from the Himalayas to the Mediterranean, is that these are not simple arguments over lines on a map. They are deeply human stories, tangled up in centuries of history, in powerful feelings of identity and belonging, and in the cold, hard calculus of resources and strategic advantage. They are about the fundamental questions of who gets to call a place home and who gets to make the rules. They are about the powerful and often destructive force of nationalism and the enduring legacy of colonialism and empire. Some of these disputes remain frozen, locked in a tense but stable stalemate. Others are active, militarized flashpoints that could erupt at any moment with devastating consequences, not just for the people who live there, but for the entire world. They are a sobering reminder that for all our talk of a globalized, interconnected world, the concepts of sovereignty, territory, and national identity are still powerful enough to make people fight and die. The lines on our maps are not set in stone. They are constantly being contested, redrawn, and defended, often at a terrible human cost. Thanks for watching.
Ready for a history adventure? Join our community. Subscribe to World History, smash that like, share with friends, and drop your thoughts below. Let's make history together. See you in the comments.